Ambassador Hotel, June 5, 1968. Ethel Kennedy on her knees on a kitchen floor, one arm raised toward the crowd, her husband dying beside her. That single frame became shorthand for her entire life, the grieving wife, defined forever by one terrible night. But that photo is the ending of a story most people never heard the beginning of. And Ethel Kennedy spent the next 56 years making sure it stayed that way. Before she was the Kennedy widow, Ethel Skakel was a rich girl from Greenwich, Connecticut, trying to marry into a family that didn't originally want her. In December 1945, 17-year-old Ethel joined the Kennedys on a ski trip to Mont-Tremblant, Quebec, brought along by her college roommate, Jean Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was there too, but he wasn't interested in Ethel. He was dating her older, quieter sister, Pat. For about 2 years, Bobby courted Pat Skakel, while Ethel hovered at the edges of the family gatherings, funny and loud and easy to overlook. When Bobby and Pat's relationship faded, he turned to the sister who'd been there the whole time. Ethel got him second. To understand why that mattered so much to her, you have to understand what she came from. The Skakels had more money than the Kennedys and far less discipline. Ethel's father, George Skakel, had started as a low-paid railroad clerk and built one of the largest privately held companies in the country. By 1936, the family was living in a 31-room mansion in Greenwich. And by most accounts, the 7 Skakel children were largely left to run wild in it. Biographers describe a household full of guns, wrecked cars, heavy drinking, and a level of chaos that made the town nervous. Her father kept his distance from religion. Her mother was a devout Catholic who drove faith hard into her daughters. Ethel absorbed both halves, an iron religious conviction and a family habit of never discussing anything embarrassing out loud. Some who knew her in school later said she'd seriously considered becoming a nun, a claim that surfaced only in later interviews and should be taken as a data point, not a fact. But it fits a pattern that would define her: intense, showy fun on the surface, rigid discipline underneath. Ethel's pursuit of this family looked less like falling in love and more like a strategy. In 1946, while Bobby was still involved with her sister, Ethel was already knocking on doors in Boston for Jack Kennedy's first congressional run. At college, she wrote her senior thesis on Jack's book, Why England Slept, her future brother-in-law's book, studied like homework, years before she'd officially joined the family. One unfriendly biography from the 1990s claims her first real interest was actually Jack, not Bobby. A claim resting on unnamed sources worth noting, but not treating as settled fact. What isn't in dispute? By the time Bobby proposed, Ethel had studied the Kennedys the way other people study for an exam, and she'd already decided this was the family she wanted to belong to. And Bobby got something out of it too. As the 7th of 9 children, overshadowed by an older brother's memory and a more charismatic one's charm, he wasn't used to being anyone's obvious favorite. Ethel adored him before he'd accomplished much of anything, loudly and without reservation. That devotion was genuine, and it also happened to be exactly the ticket she needed. They married on June 17, 1950, at St. Mary's Church in Greenwich. The Boston Globe described it, with striking bluntness, as a union of two fortunes. Marrying Bobby meant marrying into a system with its own unwritten rules, and Ethel followed them with more enthusiasm than anyone expected. Rule 1: produce. Rose Kennedy had raised 9 children. Ethel would eventually have 11, arriving roughly every 18 months between 1951 and 1968. Rule 2: serve the machine. In 1952, the young couple moved into a Boston rooming house so Bobby could run Jack's Senate campaign, and a pregnant Ethel threw the Kennedy tea parties that helped put the candidate in front of thousands of women voters. Rule 3: the family comes before the household. Bobby's career ran through his brother, and his brother's career ran through their father. Ethel's job was to keep everything at home functioning while the men were elsewhere, which more often than not they were. She didn't just tolerate this arrangement. She threw herself into it so completely that people inside the family half-joked she was more Kennedy than the Kennedys. It was a compliment, but a pointed one. You don't work that hard at belonging to something you were born into. At the family's Hyannisport compound, where the old man set the schedule and Rose set the religious tone, wives were informally but very clearly judged on enthusiasm and output. Ethel thrived there in a way her sister-in-law Jackie visibly did not. She played the games, memorized the family jokes, matched Rose's prayer for prayer, and had babies at a pace that delighted her father-in-law. But it came at a cost. Unlike Jackie, who could retreat into books, or Joan, who had music, Ethel had built no identity outside the family she'd married into, and no fallback if it were ever taken away. Segment 5. Burying her own family. In October 1955, months after Ethel gave birth to her fourth child, her parents were killed when their private plane crashed near Union City, Oklahoma. There was no prolonged public mourning. Friends later described her grief as real but almost entirely sealed off. Private, the way her mother had taught her family pain should be handled. Within a year, she and Bobby had bought Hickory Hill, the 13-bedroom Virginia estate that Jack and Jackie were letting go of after Jackie's stillbirth. Ethel moved into the house that held her sister-in-law's private grief and turned it into the loudest social address in Washington. It's a telling sequence. Orphaned by the family she was quietly leaving behind, she doubled down harder than ever on the one that merely tolerated her. Hickory Hill is where the public version of Ethel Kennedy was built, and it was an extremely good product. Magazines showed America 11 kids, horses, dogs, a sea lion at one point, touch football on the lawn, and dinner parties where fully dressed guests occasionally ended up in the pool. Historian Arthur Schlesinger famously among them, suit and all, in 1962. Ethel was cast as the anti-Jackie, unpretentious, fertile, fun, devout. Voters loved it. So did the press. Behind the image, the man of the house was rarely home. Through the McClellan Committee years and then as Attorney General, Bobby kept a schedule that made him something like a visitor in his own life. Ethel ran a household of 12 children and rotating staff, largely by herself, pregnant through most of it. Later accounts from former staff, filtered through a hostile, unauthorized biography and worth treating with real caution, describe unpaid bills and a revolving door of governesses. Those specific claims are allegations, not established fact. What isn't in dispute is the plain arithmetic. 11 pregnancies between 1951 and 1968, the deaths of both parents and a brother, and the running of the most socially demanding household in Washington, while her husband spent nearly every waking hour on his brother's administration. No honest telling of this story skips the rumors, so let's deal with them directly. The Marilyn Monroe affair story, the one most people have heard, is much weaker than its reputation suggests. Serious biographers, including Evan Thomas and Larry Tye, working from archives and hundreds of interviews, found no solid evidence of an affair between Bobby Kennedy and Monroe, and concluded the legend likely grew out of a handful of real but minor meetings, inflated after both were dead. Clearing that rumor away actually makes room for a more uncomfortable, better supported one. Unnamed friends quoted in that same unauthorized biography claimed Bobby had other affairs over the years. This is unconfirmed and comes from interested sources. But even biographers sympathetic to Ethel generally agree on one thing: she gave Bobby a devotion that wasn't fully matched. And in that family, a wife's role didn't include asking hard questions about where her husband's evenings went. November 1963 didn't just take the president. It nearly took Bobby too. His biographers describe a genuine depression. Gaunt, withdrawn, wearing his brother's old coat, disappearing into grief for the better part of a year. And here's the detail that rarely makes the highlight reel. The person who reached him in that darkness wasn't always his wife. Contemporaries describe Bobby and the newly widowed Jackie leaning on each other through that period, while Ethel, whose faith treated prolonged grief as almost a theological problem, since Jack was surely in heaven, kept the household running at full volume and kept sorrow largely off limits at home. Her response, as it so often was activity. More children, more momentum, a push to get Bobby moving again. When he ran for Senate in New York in 1964, she campaigned pregnant and the machine restarted. Meanwhile, her birth family kept absorbing tragedy that never made it into her public story. Her brother George Jr. died in a plane crash in 1966, and his widow choked to death at home almost exactly a year later. None of it touched the version of Ethel Kennedy the country saw. By most accounts, the 1968 presidential run happened partly because Ethel pushed for it. While Bobby agonized for months over challenging a sitting president and his own brother Ted urged caution, Ethel pressed him forward. Biographer Evan Thomas called her one of the most consistent voices urging Bobby to run. She believed sincerely that he was the best hope the country had, and she also, by every indication, wanted the kind of moment Jackie had already had as First Lady. Both were probably true at once. When Bobby declared in March 1968, Ethel, pregnant with her 11th child, went on the road with him, and for a few months the marriage looked exactly like the myth. Two people fully aligned, visibly happy, genuinely effective as a team. On the night Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, she stood beside Bobby in Indianapolis as he delivered one of the most remembered speeches in American political history, unscripted, to a stunned crowd. Witnesses recalled her wedding ring literally torn off in the crush of people reaching for them both. After 18 years of playing a supporting role, she was finally standing at the center of the history she'd spent her whole adult life chasing. It lasted 11 weeks. Segment 10. The Kitchen Floor. On June 4, 1968, Bobby won the California primary. Earlier that day, he'd pulled their 12-year-old son David out of a dangerous ocean current at Malibu. Just after midnight, walking through the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, he was shot. Ethel, 3 months pregnant, was steps behind him. That photograph, the one everyone knows, was taken in the minutes after. What it doesn't show is what was happening upstairs. David, alone in a hotel room, watching his father get shot on live television, hours after that same father had saved his life in the water. Bobby died the next day. 6 months later, Ethel gave birth to their daughter Rory, a child whose father had been dead for half a year. At the funeral, roughly 2 million people lined the train route from New York to Washington, and Ethel, days into widowhood, walked the length of the funeral train thanking mourners personally. Reporters aboard called it one of the most composed things they'd ever witnessed. It was genuine grief and genuine strength, and it was also the first performance of a role she'd play for the rest of her life, keeper of the story. America expected Ethel Kennedy to fade into black and stay there. Instead, within months she helped found what became Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights, installing herself as the permanent custodian of his causes: migrant labor, Native American rights, poverty. In public, she was formidable. In private, by many accounts, something colder set in. She essentially never discussed the assassination. Not with reporters, and far more significantly, not with her own children. Her sons later told biographers Peter Collier and David Horowitz that their father's death simply wasn't a topic in their house. Grief went underground the same way it always had in the Skakel household. Several of the older boys spiraled into drug use, expulsions, and a rotation of boarding schools. 2 of her sons died young, David of an overdose in 1984 at 28, after years battling addiction. Michael in a skiing accident in 1997. Ethel buried both sons the way she'd buried everyone else in her life, composed in public, sealed off in private. She never remarried across 56 years of widowhood. When she told People magazine in 1991 that remarrying would be adultery with Bobby watching from heaven, it read to some as devotion, and to others as the final version of the bargain she'd made back in 1950. She'd traded her own identity for the Kennedy name, and widowhood became the one role she intended to hold for the rest of her life. Here's what almost never makes it into the tribute pieces. After the assassination, the National Archives allowed Ethel Kennedy personal control over Bobby's papers. Not the government, the widow. For more than 4 decades, dozens of boxes covering his years at the center of American power, including material touching the Cuban Missile Crisis, sat under family control at the JFK Presidential Library. Historians who wanted access had to ask the family directly. Many did. Most waited years. Writers the family favored, like Arthur Schlesinger, who got access for his affectionate 1978 biography, got in early. Writers the family didn't trust waited, or worked around the edges with whatever they could find elsewhere. Every year of delay let the approved version of the story settle further into the historical record. broader access to the papers only really began around 2012, timed to the 50th anniversary of the missile crisis. And even then, the process still ran through the family. The woman remembered as the passive figure kneeling on a kitchen floor had, in fact, spent half a century as the gatekeeper of the historical record about her own husband. She controlled the softer version of the story too. The 2012 documentary about her life, Ethel, was directed by her own daughter Rory, the child born after the assassination, and made with Ethel's full cooperation on her terms. When the film approaches June 1968, the footage shows the 83-year-old Ethel simply waving the question away on camera. The filmmakers left that moment in. It told its own story. 2 years later, President Obama placed the Presidential Medal of Freedom around her neck. When she died in Boston on October 10, 2024, at 96, 3 presidents offered eulogies, and the obituaries ran the same kitchen photograph they always had. Closing. Look at that photograph again. A kneeling woman, one arm raised. For over 50 years, America read that gesture as helplessness. But follow what that hand did afterward. It took control of the papers. It built the foundation. It decided which questions her children were allowed to ask, which boxes historians could open, and which version of an 18-year marriage, the second-choice courtship, the family she left behind, the absences, the rumors, the sons who broke under the silence, would become the official story. Bobby Kennedy got the martyrdom. Ethel Kennedy got the archive. And the archive, not the marriage, may be the thing she never actually let anyone touch. Note on sourcing: this script draws on documented public events, dates, marriages, deaths, elections, alongside claims from named biographers: Evan Thomas, Larry Tye, Arthur Schlesinger, Peter Collier, and David Horowitz, and from Jerry Oppenheimer's unauthorized, largely hostile 1994 biography, whose unnamed source claims are flagged throughout as allegations rather than established fact.